Hi everyone, Happy New Year. I'm here today to talk to you about all of the books that I read in December. As usual, all of these books will be linked in the description box down below if you'd like to go find out more. And because I'm wrapping up these, it means that the next video I film will be my favourite books of the year video, which is always one of my favourites to do, and that'll be going up probably on Monday. So as for this stack of books, let's start with one that I didn't particularly get on with so that we can move on to more of the fun stuff. And that one was Young Anne by Dorothy Whipple. This is a novel that didn't leave me feeling very much at all. If I could tie one emotion to this book, it would probably be disappointment, because I've heard so many great things about Dorothy Whipple. Often when people talk about Persephone Books who publish this, they cite her as a great place to start with their books. And I have read lots of their books before, so I didn't heed that advice and start with Dorothy Whipple, but I was very excited to get to her work. If you are a fan of hers and this book is not your fave, then please recommend another one of hers for me to go to, because I would like to give her a second chance. This is about a woman called Anne. We start following her as a young girl. We follow her going to school. She's trying to work out what she wants to do with her life. She has a crush on someone she probably shouldn't have a crush on. It's all very predictable, and I felt it was quite fast-paced as well. We would have a lot of attention on one tiny aspect of her life, and then we would jump forward several years, and I just didn't feel that particular balance worked for me. I felt like I didn't end up really caring about anything, or I would get invested in something that had no consequence in the next chapter at all. So it was just a little bit uneven for me, I think, and for that reason I didn't particularly gel with it. But I read lots of other amazing books last year, last decade, oh my goodness. So I also dipped in and out of this book here because it's one of those kind of books. This is A Children's Literary Christmas by Anna James, who's a friend of mine. It's an anthology published by the British Library. This is a collection of extracts from wintry, Christmassy books. There's extracts from Shelley Hughes in here, A.A. Milne, Dylan Thomas, Charles Dickens. It's just one of those books where you can sit down for 5-10 minutes and read something that will warm your soul. And I look forward to coming back to it next Christmas and the following Christmases after that. Speaking of Christmas, I also read this. So I went to go and see the film Knives Out, which I would highly recommend. I would sum it up as Agatha Christie meets Get Out. And I loved it. And I had been in the mood for more crime, which I've spoken about on here before, but particularly I was looking for Christmas crime or cozy crime. And when I went to the launch of Anna's book, A Children's Literary Christmas at the British Library, I bought a few of their British Library crime classics, a couple of which are Christmas themed. So I read this, which is The Santa Claus Murder by Mavis Doriel Hay. When I started reading this, I thought I might be DNFing this book, which I say in the hope of not putting you off if you would like to pick it up, because it's a book that's laid out very strangely. I mean, brilliantly at first, because we have a map. Who does not love a map? We have a map of the downstairs of a big old manor house, so you can see where the rooms are, so that you can refer back to it when you're trying to solve the crime. And then we have a cast list, which is very handy. People in the story, there we go. And the reason that it's so handy is because these chapters are written from first-hand point of views from different characters, and then we move into the main part of the story that is narrated by the detective. And that's the point where I realised, oh, actually no, this is a really great book, but the formatting was so frustrating beforehand. These first-hand accounts are written by the characters because the detective asked them to write what they remembered of the events. However, these accounts are deliberately badly written by the author. I just think it's such a weird thing to do, to deliberately write several chapters that aren't written in the best way possible, put those first without explaining to the reader until later that they are there in that form for a weird reason that I still can't really get my head around, because it puts you off so much because they're not written that well. So persevere with the first few chapters and then it's fine. And something that is frustrating also is that sometimes characters are referred to by their first name, so say Jennifer, and then sometimes they're referred to as Mrs. Stockwell, and that's the same person, but it takes you a while to get to grips with who everybody is because there are so many characters. It really sounds like I'm complaining about this book, which I am, but it's frustrating because the book itself is actually brilliant, but the beginning makes you think it's really not going to be. Anyway, that is all to say that I really enjoyed this book, and if you like Knives Out, I think you will really like this because it has a similar premise. It is set in a manor house and the head of the family has died, and the detective is trying to work out who would benefit from the will, because the will was going to be rewritten, and there are lots of elements of the plot for you to piece together yourself. Pay attention to the first few chapters, even though they're not that well written, because the detective doesn't have that information until later, so you can do some of the detective work before he does. It's set at Christmas, it's delightful. Yes, I would recommend it. Another book that was delightful, but in a completely different way, was Confession with Blue Horses by Sophie Hardegg. Now, Sophie is a friend of mine. I'm mentioning that for transparency, but that really doesn't affect how I feel about the book that she's written. If I read it and I didn't like it, I probably wouldn't talk about it at all. That's how you know. You never ask another writer friend if they've read one of your books, because if they have and they liked it, they'll tell you. If they have and they didn't like it, then it's just, we never speak of it again. So I love this book. And this is a book that is partly set in Germany in the late 1980s and partly set in London in 2010. Sophie herself is German, and this is about, ultimately it's about the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's about the years leading up to that, about a family who lived in East Berlin and whose parents wanted to get their children out to West Berlin, and they try to escape. In the process, one of their sons is taken away from them. And in the modern day section in 2010, Ella, who is now grown up, is traveling back to Germany to try and find out what happened, to her family in the end of the 1980s, because her mother never really talked about that much, and she has such blurry memories of that time. So she's going back to try and look at official documents. It is heartbreaking. The sections that are in the 1980s gave me the same feeling that I get when I read When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit by Judith Kerr. The way that she writes family dialogue rings so true, and the way that she describes people is just absolutely delightful. Let me see if I can find you an example. Okay, so this is about their grandmother. It says, Omar was an alchemist. She could turn blouses into bottles of vodka, and bottles of vodka into tyres, and tyres into spare parts for the love seat on her allotment, where she liked to sit and read biographies of great women of culture. There are also accounts in here of other families who tried to flee East Germany. It says here, there were the two families, 4 adults and 4 children, who escaped in a homemade hot air balloon constructed with the aid of a physics textbook and an American magazine for balloonists. To test for the most airtight fabric, one of the fathers developed a device made from a hoover and a glass tube filled with water, whose level rose higher the more airtight the fabric was. Umbrella silk tested well, so did nylon, but in the end the families went for a taffeta because that was available in the shops. This book will absolutely smash your heart into pieces, so good luck with that. The next book that I read in December was this poetry collection called Not Here by Hugh Min Win. And this has been sitting on my shelf for a few months. I picked it up because I'd come across his work through Danez Smith. They're friends, they sometimes read together. And actually Danez features in some of these poems, which was really lovely. It made me smile, not in an inside joke kind of way, in just a, I don't know, warm friendship kind of way. And I'm sure that when Danez's new book, Homie, comes out later this month, that she's probably going to be in that book too. So there's a little bit of a conversation going on, and I just thought that was kind of lovely, like an echo in the poems. And if you haven't read Danez's work, then I recommend doing so because they're great. Not Here is about several different things. I would say the linking feelings are confusion, trying to work through things. Primarily, it's about the relationship that he has with his mother, how he loves her dearly, but how she is not okay with the fact that he is gay, and she will not talk to him about that. But then when she finds out that he's dating a white boy, she says that's okay because that will save him. And he doesn't know how to feel about that. He's pleased that she can find something that she likes about a situation, but it's such a weighted thing to say, and he doesn't know how that reflects on his relationship, how he feels about his partner and about race in general. He's also reconciling in here with memories of being sexually assaulted when he was younger, memories that he didn't have until later. So he's talking about desire and being with people he wants to be with. And then he's also talking about these conflicting emotions that he has because of terrible experiences that he's had. So I think really this book is about not having the answers and that being okay, trying to muddle through and work them out. This book is Hugh Nguyen showing his working. There's just something open about this book. And obviously lots of poems are honest, and honesty is something that makes work powerful. But I don't just mean honesty. I mean open in the sense of being truthful, but how that truth changes from day to day, and acknowledging that the truth is not one answer that you achieve and then everything is great. These poems are a grieving for loose ends, for memories that you've kept that you're hoping will one day turn into something beautiful but are actually just sitting there rotting on your shelf. It's also a little grieving for people that he's lost in his life, and it has amazing lines in like this: I describe your funeral like a party you forgot to attend. It wasn't the same without you. I also read this graphic memoir in December, and it was brilliant. It took me by surprise actually how much I enjoyed it, because it snowballs the power it has, it drags you along with it, and it's so well done, so layered. Really, really recommend it, especially if you have read the non-fiction book everyone's talking about at the moment called 5, which is about the women that Jack the Ripper murdered. So this is Becoming, Unbecoming by Una. Una is a pen name. It's set in 1977, and she's talking about when she was 12, growing up in West Yorkshire, and the Yorkshire Ripper was on the loose. Una was reading in the newspapers about how this man was killing sex workers, and quite frankly, the newspapers didn't care. And you can read extracts from what was printed at the time in this book. It wasn't until he murdered someone who was not a sex worker and the papers started saying that this woman that he had murdered was innocent and how terrible it was, that they really upped their investigation, because suddenly he wasn't just murdering sex workers anymore, but in actual fact he'd been murdering all kinds of women since the beginning. It's just they hadn't associated those crimes with him because they just decided that he was a man who only murdered sex workers. It is infuriating the way that this investigation was handled by both the police and the press, the way that the women were talked about, and how this reflected on Una personally, because that's what this book is. It's her memoir. So she was 12, as I said, in 1977, and she had been sexually assaulted herself, and she had internalized all of this blame in part because of the way that the investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper was going, and she didn't realize that she had done that until much later. This book is fueled by anger, rightful anger, and it's not just her personal story of these things, but also it's full of facts as well, and those statistics escalate towards the end. I don't know, it just feels like she's a lawyer in a case and she's just slam dunking all of this information, and it's so perfectly timed, and by the end you just realize how much of an amazing case she has put together for herself and for these other women as well. And it's also beautifully illustrated. So some of it, let me find some examples. Some of it looks like this, and she's illustrating lots of different things to talk about, lots of different events that are going on. And then sometimes it's more abstract, showing how she's feeling, and there are fewer words on the page. I bought this at the House of Illustration, which is a wonderful art space and bookshop near King's Cross. And I bought it a while ago. It was an exhibit on female artists, comic book artists specifically. And I bought this afterwards and have been meaning to read it for ages, and I'm annoyed that it sat on my shelf for so long. But on the other hand, I think sometimes we read books at the best time, don't we? So I'm glad I read it in December and loved it as much as I did. And I highly recommend picking it up if that sounds of interest to you. As you can tell, I read lots of great books in December. The next one is no exception. It is Elizabeth Lists by Lula Ellender, which is actually quite difficult to say. Elizabeth's Lists. This, I think, is a great book to read at this time of year because lists and organisation and New Year and all of that stuff, this gave me all the warm, cosy feelings that I get when I read a Persephone book that I adore. This is about Elizabeth, who is Lula Ellender's grandmother. So her mother gave her a book of Elizabeth's lists, and each chapter has one of those lists. I'm gonna find one for you. There we go. There is a list. Each chapter has a list at the beginning, and then she talks about that part of her life, using the list as reference and also some of Elizabeth's diaries as well. So some of the details in here are directly from the diaries, some of those are from other research that she has done, some of it is an imagining. So it is a jigsaw puzzle, and she readily admits at the beginning that there are some things in here that maybe are her interpretation of events, but ultimately that doesn't matter. She isn't trying to write an exact factual piece about her grandmother. She's just trying to feel closer to her. And Elizabeth had a fascinating life. She was the daughter of a British ambassador, so she grew up in China in the 1930s. And in fact, when she was there, she was shot in the head, not through the head, but in the head by the Japanese, and rescued by someone who she then later married, who was a British diplomat. So she travelled a lot when she was married as well. They were in London and Oxford, but then they were in Spain during Franco's regime. They were in Lebanon, they were in Brazil. And a lot of these lists are about the things that she packed to take from place to place. And the lists also were a way for her to feel in control of her mental state. She suffered very badly from postnatal depression, and I completely identified with that need to organise and try and feel in control of things when you really don't feel in control of things. The family relations that she has, especially with her brother, are so touching. And I don't want to go into that too much because I think you need to just read it and discover it for yourself. But this book, honestly, I fell in love with it quite a lot. So I really, really, really recommend reading it. And let me see if I can find you a little bit just to tempt you further. This is something that Lula notes about her grandmother. Elizabeth was masterful at capturing people's foibles and peculiarities. She saw the ridiculous in situations and had an eye for detail, which makes me think she was intending to use her diaries as source material for a writing project. Why else note events such as this? Quote, "My day was made by Mrs. Weddell, whose knickers fell off at a tea party the ambassadress was giving on the veranda. They were curious ones too, with no sides. I don't like to be bunchy over the hips, so I have them made this way," she said, holding them up for all to see before she stuffed them away into her bag. This book will make you laugh, it will make you cry. It is brilliant. I am carrying over 2 books into January that I didn't finish in December, which are Salt Slow by Julia Armfield, which is a short story collection, and The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, which I am really enjoying. So I'll talk about them when I finish reading them in January. And finally, the last one that I read in December was this graphic novel called When I Arrived at the Castle by Emily Carroll. And you may be able to tell by the cover here that it's a little bit saucy, this one. I read her graphic short story collection Into the Woods a few years ago when it came out, and I liked it, but I didn't love it as much as everybody else seemed to be loving it. But I adored her colour palette and how gruesome it was. Let me find you a page that I can show. So she has a limited colour palette. She uses really bright colours, and then the rest is in black and white. This is wonderful. It is a gory, sexy, queer Bluebeard retelling. So it's about a woman who goes to a castle and she meets this very sexy woman, and then there are lots of doors with things hidden behind them. And I think that's all I want to say about it, because the joy is just in reading it for yourself. But it is dark and gruesome and, yeah, as I said, sexy. So if those things tick all your boxes, then I recommend going out and picking up a copy. Let me see if I can find you another page to show you as well. Look at that. Look at that. Beautiful. So those are all the books that I read in December. It was a great reading month, and a few of these have made my favourite books of the year. So I'll talk about those and the other books that I have loved in 2019 on Monday. Let me know what you read in December in the comments section down below. I hope you're having a great start to the year. I'll speak to you very soon. Lots of bookish love. Bye.